his trimaran converted to trawling mode. The mariner, having set an eastern course, approached the sprawling atoll, which emerged jaggedly from the ocean like a mammoth floating trash heap, absurdly golden in the glow of the glorious afternoon sun. Hello and welcome to the Atoll, your home for Waterworld fandom. In today's long-awaited video, we will look into the legendary story of the most iconic of Waterworld set pieces, as well as the namesake of this channel, the floating city known as the Atoll. First, we will discuss the fabled construction and filming of the Atoll set, and then conclude the video with a look at how the Atoll fits into the greater lore of Waterworld. So, without further ado, let's dive into everything we know about the Atoll. To begin this story, we have to first talk about the very inception of Waterworld, that is, Peter Rader's original scripts. The Atoll came from one of Rader's first 7 drafts of Waterworld, initially created for Largo Entertainment, where the inhabitants of Waterworld lived on a floating artificial island called Oasis. This iteration of the Atoll envisioned it as a collection of individual boats tied together in a circle of survival, similar to how wagons would form a fortified circle in the Old West. These boats would represent the individual functions of the floating city, such as a school boat and a vegetable barge. After the script was bought by Universal Studios in 1992, a second and third scriptwriter, R.J. Stewart and David Twohy, were brought on to try their hand at refining the script and giving it a more gritty and realistic direction. They worked with concept artist Steve Burg, who had previously worked on Dances with Wolves, to formulate original artwork for this new project. In 1993, Burg was officially hired by Tig Productions, Kevin Costner's own production company on the Warner Brothers lot, named after his grandmother. Burg drew many different potential versions of the Atoll, including this very appealing spiral design and this design that looks as if the Atoll were built off a large cargo ship. Burg continued to envision the Atoll containing several sections, which included a farm barge, prison, school, and a tavern. Though the real tangible version of the Atoll would come from the incredibly ambitious Dennis Gassner. Dennis Gassner is one of Hollywood's most acclaimed production designers, having won an Academy Award in 1992 for Bugsy, and then gone on to work with such projects as The Truman Show, Oh Brother Where Art Thou, Jarhead, and more recently, Blade Runner 2049 and 1917. And it's his tremendous vision that would bring one of the most legendary movie sets ever created to life. Gassner joined Waterworld during pre-production in May 1993, while director Kevin Reynolds was still on the set of Rapa Nui, which was being filmed on Easter Island, a remote island in the South Pacific. In fact, after Gassner read the script, he flew out to Easter Island for 4 days to meet with Reynolds to start imagining the universe of Waterworld. After meeting with Reynolds, Gassner embarked on a 24-day, 18-airplane journey across the world in search of the perfect location to stage the filming of Waterworld. The first location that Gassner visited was the Kona coast on the Big Island of Hawaii. From Hawaii, he traveled to Japan and Hong Kong, then dropped by the Great Barrier Reef in Australia. He then flew to Malta, an island in the Mediterranean off of Sicily, and then concluded his expedition by looking at locations in the Bahamas and Florida. In the end, though, it was actually the first location that Gassner visited, Kawaihae Harbor in Hawaii, that was determined to be the best suited place to stage the production of Waterworld. An empty sugar shack warehouse would be used as studio spaces for interior sets, and the water in and just out of the harbor was uniquely beautiful, with a vibrant blue that would just look spectacular on film. The harbor would also provide a large protected body of water for Gassner to fulfill his ultimate dream, to build a full-scale floating city called an atoll for its circular configuration like that of its ring-shaped coral reef namesake. The idea of using a miniature set was tossed around in pre-production, and even miniatures of the atoll were constructed for pre-visualization, but it was understood by the entire production team that a full-size set was needed to pull off the epic scope that Waterworld was attempting to capture. Kawaihae Harbor offered the ideal openness to the ocean so that the atoll set could be positioned and shot against the open sea, waters which were mostly outside of the main shipping lines, yet still in the protection of the harbor, though for a large part of the production, the atoll would be towed into the open ocean to capture wide angles and helicopter shots. Back in California, work on the production design had moved from Costner's Tig Productions to the Universal Studios lot. It was determined that the trimaran and the atoll needed to be scaled to each other in order for the film set to work on a practical level. The gates of the atoll would need to be grand enough to emit the full trimaran to create the iconic image of the mariner entering the floating city. The Jeanne trimaran was actually approved by the production team before the construction of the atoll set, so all dimensions of the atoll would be created in proportion to the trimaran. Reynolds wanted every aspect of the atoll design to reflect the resourcefulness of its inhabitants. He also wanted many common-day items scattered throughout the set, but centuries removed, to constantly remind the viewer, subconsciously, that Waterworld existed because of the short-sighted actions of us in the present. This was another way to push the environmental undertones that are woven throughout the film. Reynolds called Waterworld an eco-fable, meaning that the film would allude to the environmental failures of mankind in the present, and that mankind in the future would be constantly feeling the dropout of these failings. As mentioned previously, a miniature of the atoll was created before construction of the full-scale set began. Set designer John Dexter built an 11-foot model of the atoll to give producers an idea of what they were getting into. A miniature was also used to test the structural integrity of the atoll design by placing it in a special pool in a ship model testing facility in San Diego. This was an important step for Gassner and his team of set designers, as nothing like the atoll had ever been created before. There were no guidelines for creating such a structure, and it had to be built to literally survive the open ocean. The team ultimately came up with plans for a design 365 feet in diameter and a quarter mile in circumference, the largest floating articulated structure in the world. They also wanted to avoid creating a design that was too obviously symmetrical. They determined that the atoll would be constructed of 9 linked sections. Each of the sections would represent a different function of the atoll society and would include entry gates, fishery, assay office, manufacturing plant, tavern and trading post, meeting hall, distillation plant and Gregor's tower, organo barge, and armory. There was only one problem. How were they going to make the atoll float? For this question, Gassner turned to visual effects expert Peter Chasney, who was already hard at work on the logistics of the trimaran transformation. Chasney was an experienced sailor and knew a lot about water dynamics. Chasney's solution was very simple. The foundation of the atoll would consist of very large and stable steel barges constructed of culvert tubes and 10-inch I-beams. There was still one problem, however. The construction of the foundation was far beyond the technical skills of anyone currently on the film's crew. Gassner then recalled working with a Honolulu company called Navitec earlier to obtain production boats. From this, he discovered that Navitec was actually a subsidiary of Lockheed, the enormous aerospace and defense corporation. Gassner went to Lockheed and asked if they would design the foundation of the futuristic city. Lockheed was surprised by the proposal but found the engineering challenge appealing. They agreed to design the atoll foundation and contracted Navitec to build it. With time ticking down to when the main phase of production would begin, it was decided that drafting the blueprints for the atoll would happen simultaneously with the construction of the set in order to save time. Gassner called it a living sculpture, and that its construction was a mad metamorphosis, with design, engineering, and construction all happening at the same time. The production was a tremendous boost to the island's economy and would present an opportunity for hundreds of welders and labor people to pick up employment. During this period of rushed construction, many more questions needed to be answered. It was critical that the weight distribution was even so that the floating city would be stable, even in bad weather. Lockheed did wind analysis on the design and determined that it was stable in 45-knot winds, that being equivalent to hurricane force gales. In February of 1994, Navitec finished construction of the flotation units in Honolulu and transported them on barges 200 miles on a 24-hour voyage to Kawaihae Harbor. Once the units arrived at the harbor, an unseen challenge confronted the crew: how to take the 8-ton flotation units off the barges, given that Kawaihae Harbor did not have any available cranes. The first unit took an excruciating 36 hours to get off the barge and into the water using rollers. The second unit was unloaded by flooding the barge it was on and lowering the unit into the water. By the time the third unit arrived, a 200-ton crane was obtained along with some smaller directing cranes, which greatly simplified the process of unloading the flotation units. By March, all the units were placed end to end along the harbor's pier in a spectacular 1,000-foot chain. Once the Atoll foundation had been delivered, an army of 500 laborers began building out all the set details, as well as the props and costumes that would adorn the Atoll civilization. Each of the 9 floating foundations had towers, catwalks, boats, and other structures built into them. Work on the Atoll went 24 hours a day through April and May as the crew pushed to get the set ready for shooting the film in June. This is when concerns about the swelling budget of the film started to arise as the filmmakers continued an all-out effort to finish the unparalleled massive set. According to the Internet Movie Database, the construction of the Atoll set used up all the available steel in the Hawaiian Islands, and when more was requested to finish the set, it was flown from California. Also, according to IMDb, the cost of the 1,000-ton Atoll set was around $22 million US. The weight of the Atoll became a major factor when creating the set. Every piece added needed to be weighed to ensure that the Atoll was not becoming too heavy and therefore unstable and dangerous. In the end, the floating city was 400 tons over the calculated limit, and reductions needed to be made. Gassner and the set designers chose to remove weight from areas not visible on film, putting the production team in the water to cut out excess decking structure. The production team chose to have much of the Atoll's decking be a metal screen. This added structural support and looked great on film, allowing for the beautiful color of the ocean to shine through, but also allowed for any water that splashed onto the decking to simply drain through and not pool up, which would add even more weight to the already oversized set. The Atoll gates were the most technically difficult section of the set to create. The gates were constructed on flotation number 1, or F1, which was the heaviest of all the flotation foundations at 131 tons. Each side of the gate was actually dual folding, with an inner and outer section that folded in to each other. The gates were so heavy that as the doors opened, a counterweight would descend to keep the flotation unit erect. The outer gates rotated with the aid of hydraulic motors, and the inner gates were driven by electric motors and sprocket. As the gates opened, a 55-foot path was cleared just enough to emit the width of the trimaran. Because the two gates needed to come together perfectly, an I-beam was installed 5 feet under the water to connect the two sides. F1 was by far the most problematic and delicate of all the sections of the Atoll, especially considering that part of the gate would be blown up by a renegade smoker jet ski. Catwalks and sites for camera setups were added throughout the multi-level design of the Atoll. Catwalks were built light as not to add weight, but certified by an architectural engineer so that they would not collapse during production. The average height of the Atoll walls was around 30 feet. On F2, a fishery was created, complete with a 28-foot mutant shark. The set dressers made the mutant shark look picked over, hinting at the fact that the Atoll society was one in decline. F3 contains the assay office, the place where the mariner goes to trade his valuable dirt for chits. The assay office was one of the smaller and narrower flotation units, but being narrower means that the unit had a higher center of gravity and it failed many of the early model tests that Lockheed conducted. In the end, the production team added to the unit, making it 12 feet wider. Flotation Unit 4, or F4, contains the manufacturing plant. The thinking was that the atollers would collect various plastic items floating on the surface of the ocean after the Great Deluge and reform these plastics into materials for constructing their floating city. According to the production team, the manufacturing plant was actually the invention of the idiosyncratic genius Gregor. Power from the windmill would be used to grind down the plastic, and billows would heat giant crucibles which would melt down the plastic, which would be poured into various molds, like the sheets that make up the exterior walls of the atoll. And this is an interesting point that does not get mentioned a lot. The production team actually did not intend to have the atoll set look as if it was constructed of steel, but instead wanted to have it look as if it was formed from recycled plastics. The set designers went as far as coating all the surfaces in a shellac to make the atoll look as if it was constructed of weathered plastics. The windmill marked the highest point on the atoll set at nearly 60 feet above the water's surface and weighed about 5,000 pounds. The windmill would also provide electricity to power the various atoll systems, like the lights that come on after the sun sets on Waterworld. In actuality, a small gas engine powered the canvas-stretched blades of the windmill. It also had a sail on the backside that would rotate the entire assemblage when the wind would blow hard. And the manufacturing plant is also where the Deacon interrogates the two, quote, heartbeats that are strung up among the mechanical cogs for any information about the mysterious girl with a tattooed map to dry land. Two closely connected flotation barges, F5 and 6, make up the trading post / tavern and the meeting hall. Set dresser Nancy Hay assumed that all of the items in the atoll would be salvaged from the sea. She assumed that something like the Sargasso Sea, a section of the Pacific Ocean northeast of the West Indies, where, because of trade winds, large amounts of floating garbage collect, that this would also occur in Waterworld, and the atollers would glean these areas for useful items. Hay also knew she needed a lot of random items to fill out the set. She was able to acquire a huge haul of odd items and parts from all kinds of productions from the MGM back lot. These were packed into 11 40-foot shipping containers and sent out to Hawaii. Hay also acquired 15,000 pounds of fishing net from a man in San Pedro, all of which was used to help fill out the set dressing of the atoll. Also part of F5/6 was an ancient Chinese junk that served as a meeting hall for the elders. This was meant to be a place of great importance to the community, and the elegant design of the Chinese boat reflects this. It ended up being the only part of the set that was built from wood, but this actually created some problems with weighing too much. To compensate for this, Gassner and his team chose to create some of the boat's siding out of foam and replace some of the wooden beams with composite beams. F7 contains two iconic features, the distillation plant and Gregor's Tower. The distillation plant, another invention of Gregor's, was essential to the atoll society, as it is where they transformed salt water into pure hydro. Gregor's Tower was designed to resemble a Jules Verne-style laboratory, where the wily inventor would conduct his research and experiments. Gregor's Tower also had a 4-point rigging suspension at the top that would be used to lift Gregor's escape dirigible. For more information on Gregor's dirigible, check out my deep dive video on that memorable Waterworld flying device. Gregor's laboratory, as described in the novelization, was a workshop of wheezing billows, the skeletons of fish, various fruit grafting experiments, bottles and tubes and flasks on tables. Gregor also had an open tabletop library of magazines with useful texts like a Chilton's manual for a Ford Mustang, which aided the inventor in redeveloping the ancient technologies to be utilized in the Atoll's infrastructure. In Waterworld, magazines are often considered the most valuable item to trade, even more so than pure dirt. According to the novelization, Gregor learned to read from his grandmother. F7 was actually the first set created and set the look for the rest of the atoll that followed. A few of the flotation tubes were removed from F7 and sunk to the bottom of the ocean so that the beautiful turquoise water could be seen in the interior shots of Gregor's tower. The tubes were put back on by a scuba diving team afterwards so that the structure would remain safe during the remainder of the shoot. Also attached to F7 is the boat that Helen and Enola live in, which can only be seen in the extended cut of Waterworld, and if you look closely you'll see that the walls are covered in charcoal drawings of Enola's visions. And interestingly, 60 to 70 boats were built into the structure of the atoll. F8 contains what we know as the organo barge. The organo barge is a combination of a farm where they grow plants on multi-layered terraces and a cemetery where the atollers recycle their dead and other waste into compost for growth of more plants. This was the largest in diameter of all the units and the last one to be completed. A large and ancient lemon tree made of wood, steel, and foam is growing at the top of the terraces. The levels below that have food growing among the headstones of the departed atollers, and on the bottom level was a pool of organic sludge. In actuality, the pool contained 3,000 gallons of a mixture of sawdust and biodegradable food thickener. The final section of the atoll, F9, contains the armory where the atollers stashed all of their weapons. The armory is where every man, woman, and child would take up crossbow or spear to fight any invaders that challenged the atoll society. As a side note, according to the prop master on the film, 5,000 arrows were made for the film's crossbows, as well as 500 shark tooth spears and 500 shark tooth spear balls. According to the production team, the armory was the easiest to create and the easiest to make adjustments to as the atoll evolved during construction. All the sections of the atoll were connected with shock cells, or knuckles as they became known on set, which would allow the sections to move together but also independently as waves passed under the floating city. 6 tons of high-grade 2-inch chain and nearly 100 tons of anchoring held the massive floating set in place. Producer Charles Gordon, during the production of Waterworld, kept the original atoll concept art on his desk of a handful of boats tied together to remind himself how far the production had come. When Gassner had first proposed the full atoll set to him, he had thought he was on candid camera. As the atoll set neared completion, local Hawaiians approached the production company about giving the atoll set a blessing ceremony. At the ceremony, a local shaman, or kahuna, brought the cast, crew, and even local businesses together to give the set a blessing and exchange of good intentions. For the filmmakers, the atoll set became a symbol of the human spirit that defied all expectations to pull off the epic production of Waterworld. After a year and a half of unprecedented pre-production, principal photography was ready to begin on Waterworld at the end of June 1994. The very first scene shot on film was the mariner bartering at the gates of the atoll, then entering their society. This marked a symbolic beginning for principal photography for the cast and crew, as they also entered into this new phase of production. Safety on the floating set was of the utmost importance. At least 20 water safety crew members were on set at any time, with an overall crew of about 100 safety people working on the film. R.A. Rondell and his stunt team rehearsed all the stunts thoroughly before cameras started rolling. A safety supervisor reviewed the entire set and marked sharp and unsafe areas with fluorescent paint so that the film crew could avoid them. They also marked the underwater mooring lines so that stunt people would not jump into them. A second team was set out to constantly skim the harbor and pick up debris that was constantly falling off the atoll. Water tests were conducted weekly to ensure that the harbor was not being contaminated and that the production team would leave the waters pristine after the film wrapped. However, for director Kevin Reynolds and director of photography Dean Semler, they found that shooting inside the atoll was a challenge, as the set was almost overly rich in detail. They described it as a Brillo pad in which the actors and extras would get lost among the monochromatic backdrop of the set. They used lights, lenses, and atmospheric smoke to pull principal characters out of the atoll backdrop. And due to the film being shot on water, less lighting equipment could be used, and so the crew was much more dependent on natural light. Matching the lighting from shot to shot became a huge challenge for Semler, not to mention that the color of the ocean and sky would change depending on the time of day, but Semler charged forward in a mad attempt to stay on schedule. The camera department used a kit of 3 gold Panavision cameras, including an A and B camera and a smaller camera known as a hothead, which could be placed on a barge-mounted crane and operated with a remote control. On days where a large amount of special effects were being set off, as many as 6 cameras would roll to capture these more expensive and difficult sequences. Steadicams were also implemented, which allowed the camera operator to attach the camera to themselves with a vest and get handheld shots that remained smooth and steady. Steadicam operator Mark O'Kane was applauded by the rest of the crew for his strength and endurance, operating the heavy camera setup while bouncing all day on the open ocean. The film also presented challenges with the need to constantly shoot against the open sea. Every day of production had to be meticulously planned out in accordance to how the atoll was going to be oriented in relation to the coastline. Ransom Walrid was given the responsibility of organizing the fleet of tugboats and production boats that would surround the atoll set and move the floating city. The filmmakers went to the U.S. Coastal Trade Commission to license the atoll, but discovered there was no classification for the largest floating articulated structure in the world, so it was deemed that the atoll would be an unmanned vessel, which meant the atoll could not be moved with people on it. Billy Pew Pew High was named the official captain and in charge of supervising the atoll and all its movements. Rotating the atoll in the harbor took around 6 hours, with the coordination of tugboats and motorboats manipulating a system of ropes and chains above water, and underwater a team of divers working giant airbags to lift and shift the massive anchors. Rotating the set usually was conducted at night so that the shooting schedule could continue during the day. As mentioned before, the stunts were coordinated by R.A. Rondell. He worked with professional water skiers and jet skiers to fine-tune the ramps that would launch them over the walls of the atoll while being towed by the Smoker skyboat. I will go into more detail on this in a future video on everything we know about the Smoker skyboat, or also known as the Smoker scout plane. 2 different ramps were built on custom-fashioned catamarans. The shot of the water skier splashing into the center of the atoll was captured by having stunt people leap from a chair-like rig suspended below a helicopter. The smokers also had speedboats with ladders that could fold forwards against the walls of the atoll so that they could invade the floating city like a medieval fortress. The smoker that collides with the mariner in the cage on the organo barge was rigged up to a 500-foot zipline attached to a 200-foot crane. The collision causes the cage to fall into the pool of ooze. In actuality, the prisoner cage had a special hydraulic rig that lowered and raised it in and out of the slime. By all accounts, Kevin Costner was a really good sport about this arduous shoot in which he was submerged in the sludge, though the set around the goo pool was incredibly slick and the production team was constantly slipping and falling. The mariner is freed by Helen. He agrees to help them escape the battle, but first the atoll gates need to be opened to allow the trimaran through. The mariner plunges into the water and swims across the atoll lagoon with the speed of a dolphin. To achieve this swimming shot, Costner worked with a professional swimmer and was pulled 25 feet through the water with a cable, while Peter Romano, the cinematographer in charge of all the underwater shots, was attached to a harness holding a 100-pound camera and pulled alongside him. Meanwhile, outside the atoll gates, the Hellfire gunner boat rails against the walls of the floating city. The simulated gunfire was engineered by Marty Breeson, special effects supervisor, and a crew of more than 150 experts, the largest crew assembled up until that time. On a heavy effects day, the crew would be triggering more than 3,000 bullet hits on the atoll wall and in the surrounding waters. For a more detailed breakdown on the gunfire special effects, check out my deep dive on the Hellfire gunner boat. Hundreds of feet of underwater piping were also installed under the Atoll lagoon with special liquid propane gas valves that pumped gas into the water to create the various fires on its surface during the smoker attack, and a minimum of 50 smoke machines were also used during the battle scenes. During July and August of 1994, all of the principal photography was completed with the Atoll anchored safely within Kawaihae Harbor. In early September, it was decided that 3 tugboats would pull the Atoll set half a mile west and anchor in waters 96 feet deep. With the set in deeper waters and disconnected from the harbor docks, the production team could more freely rotate the enormous floating set. The deeper waters offered the same beautiful colors as they did in the harbor, and out in the open sea, the production team made friends with the creatures that inhabited the waters there, even able to pet some tropical fish. A 30-foot whale shark made regular appearances, and the team saw a group of mantises mating nearby. Whenever the day's production called for explosions, a local marine laboratory would make certain that no porpoises were nearby by doing a flyover in a helicopter. A scuba team of 50 to 60 scuba divers were assigned to clean the ocean floors as the production continued. Principal photography continued at sea with the Atoll remaining anchored just west of the island. On the morning of October 4th, an alarm was sounded on the Hawaiian island. An approaching tsunami was intimate, and the production team had to take immediate action to save the Atoll set. Every prop was quickly stored in the sugar shack, and the production boats, including the Atoll set, were moved to 600 fathoms of water since the tsunami would not have crested at that depth and would simply roll underneath the floating vessels. The whole incident was over in a few hours, and the crew returned to work by the end of the day. The Atoll was moved again in late October, brought back to the harbor for a few weeks of repairs and rewelding. The open ocean had taken its toll on the structure, and the crew wanted to make sure that it would remain safe for the final stretch of production. In mid-November, the Atoll was towed back out to sea one last time. During the filming, the press caught wind of Waterworld's arduous and groundbreaking production, but chose to report on the efforts of the production team negatively, exaggerating or outright making up drama and hardships on set. The production team then chose to not show the press their work in progress, which backfired and further stoked the rumors surrounding Waterworld's so-called turbulent production. Finally, on December 8th, the Waterworld crew wrapped the 5-month production in Hawaii. The complexity and scale of the film had extended the production schedule far beyond the initial plans. As Dean Semler said, "Making Waterworld was always a challenge, sometimes darn near impossible, but it was a remarkable experience, and we did it." And while all the scenes with the Atoll were done with practical effects, it should be mentioned that some visual effects work was done in post-production. CGI cable addition and removal was used in the water skiing tow sequence, which I'll go into further detail in a future video on the Smoker scout plane. The cable between the trimaran and the Hellfire gunner boat is also a CGI addition. Many shots of the Atoll had accidental boats, buoys, bodies of dry land, rigging and safety cables that came into frame and then were digitally removed by the McAllister's team of VFX artists. Also, very interestingly, this shot of the Atoll lookout peering through his telescope at the approaching Smoker army is a CGI shot with the aging of the telescope lens and the army being more than doubled by cloning and duplicating the existing few watercraft. Now that we have fully gone through all the known details about the construction and filming of the Atoll set, let's take a look at how it fits into the greater Waterworld lore. It goes without saying that since the Atoll is such a central aspect of Waterworld, it's obviously going to find its way into every aspect of Waterworld's marketing and expanded universe, but let's see if we can pull out some additional tidbits of information from the nooks and crannies of Waterworld's lore. In the novelization, the Atoll actually has a name, that being Oasis, like that of Rader's original screenplay. And also, interestingly in the novelization, the tied together boats of the Atoll survivors towards the end of the film is dubbed New Oasis. The novelization, along with the extended cut of the film, also make mention of the destitute people that live on rafts and other small boats that float just outside of the protection of the Atoll walls. These people long to join the Atoll society and will trade anything, including their own hair, to obtain some fresh hydro. and some will even strike a side barter. But when the mariner is permitted through the front gates, the gatekeepers use water cannons to keep these poor people from entering the atoll as well. In the novelization, we learn a little bit more about the religious beliefs of the atollers as the mariner passes the funeral ceremony taking place on the Organo barge. The atollers recite a sermon and cut the woman's hair before lowering her into the sludge. The sermon ends with the line, "In presence of Him who leads us." This leads us to believe that the atollers do indeed believe in some kind of singular god, a belief that the mariner greatly rejects according to the novelization, claiming that he only believes in himself and his will to survive. Interestingly also, in the novelization, the atollers use a primitive form of biological warfare, jellyfish. Shortly after the smoker invading army is spotted on the horizon, the quote, nets of living weapons were reeled in, jellyfish for catapulting, and later in the fight these poisonous jellyfish were indeed thrown at the smoker invaders. After the smokers take the atoll, the smoker ledger in the novelization informs us of what kind of provisions the atoll had, giving us a little insight into the atollers' diet. The ledger says, quote, 660 Gs of hydro salvage, 3/4 grade or better, 120 keys of assorted edibles, jerked fish, plankton cakes, 60 keys of lamp oil, 44 old growth grapevines, and 10 assorted fruit trees. I must note that there's no mention of the atoll in the Children of the Leviathan comic book series. Instead, the series focuses on the Foundation, a society of people that have lived in an underwater bunker for centuries, completely sealed off from the surface of Waterworld. The atoll is a main feature on the board of the pinball game, taking up a large section of the top area of the cabinet with this 3D casting of the atoll walls which can flip and become the Ds. Also, the Waterworld board game has many atolls that serve as places on the playing board where participants can pick up valuable items to help advance their position in the game. The atoll is of course present in every iteration of the video games as well, from the SNES to the Genesis, to the Game Boy, to this tattered rendering in the Virtual Boy. And let's not forget that the atoll makes an appearance in the PC game, The Quest for Dryland, and is even partially recreated in the sets that are used for the live-action cutscenes. And it of course makes an appearance in the mysterious images of the unreleased Waterworld games, including the Sega Saturn game and the Atari Jaguar on-rail shooter game. And what's interesting is that in some of these games you do not only explore Oasis, the atoll in the film, but also have a chance to see the other atoll societies like Atoll Serena, Atoll Merla, Atoll Corona, Atoll Tirana, Atoll Alina, Atoll Hala, Atoll Kerala, Atoll Sola, Atoll Azora, and Atoll Cora. And even the film and novel themselves make mention of the other atolls, like when the mariner tells the atoll banker that he has acquired the dirt from a derelict atoll 30 horizons west of Oasis. During the town meeting, in the book and extended version of the film, an old atoller remarks, "When I was young, there were lots of atolls. In one day you could visit 2 or 3 of them." And the Deacon himself also makes reference to other atolls in his first soliloquy to his fellow smokers after the atoll attack, where he refers to a time when every horizon had an atoll upon it, implying that the atoll societies at one time were much more prevalent, but now were slowly dying out. And one other video game that also has the atoll is of course GameCube's Universal Studios Theme Park Adventure, where we can see a pre-rendered animation of the plane crashing into the live stunt show at Universal Studios. And this, of course, leads us into our discussion of Waterworld, a live Sea War spectacular where the entire show takes place within the walls of the atoll. And since the live show is considered to be a sequel to the film, we can determine that after the smoker attack on the floating city, the atollers were actually able to return to their home and rebuild their society. That is, of course, until Helen returns to tell them of dry land. And while the Atoll of the stunt show is obviously not a one-to-one recreation of the Atoll in the film, it does capture much of the flavor of its silver screen counterpart with the gates, towers, high walkways, and watery lagoon. As for the one in Hollywood, it even houses many props used in the film. For a much deeper dive into everything about Universal Studios' Waterworld live show, be sure to check out my video on just that topic. And it's sort of reassuring to know that even though the groundbreaking Atoll set constructed in Hawaii may have been dismantled and sold for scrap metal over a quarter century ago, that this Atoll, located at multiple theme parks across the world, lives on today, impressing and delighting new generations that may not even be aware of its fabled cinematic origin. And that is where I'll end this video. This has been the story of Waterworld's floating city. Thanks for sticking with me until the end. I have wanted to make this video ever since I thought of the concept of creating a Waterworld fan YouTube channel, and it feels great to have this huge milestone finally met. If you enjoyed this video, let me know in the comments down below, or consider giving it a thumbs up. And also, while you're here, subscribe and check out all the other Waterworld deep dives on this channel. I know that recently a large number of my views have come from non-subscribers, so please know that subscribing really helps to grow the channel as we continue to push towards our 1,000 sub goal. Also, feel free to check out the Atoll Instagram where I post routinely and where you can also hit me up directly. I love conversing with fellow fans. And so with that, thanks, as always, for joining me at the Atoll.